Good morning, Shavua Tov, Boker Tov. This week's Torah portion begins with the commandment to Aaron, the high priest, to kindle the flames of the menorah in the tabernacle each and every morning. And our rabbis explain, why does this week's Torah portion follow last week's Torah portion? Because last week's Torah portion concluded with the dedication of the temple, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and how on 12 consecutive days, the leader of each of the 12 tribes brought gifts and offerings in honor of the dedication of the tabernacle. And Rashi quotes the Talmud that says that when Aaron saw all the tribes bringing their gifts, he felt envious, chol shadato, which means his spirit, his morale was a little bit broken, because he said, me and my tribe, the tribe of Levi, we serve in the temple, but we didn't even get to bring any gifts for the dedication of the temple. So God says to Aaron, don't feel bad. Don't feel discouraged. You're going to get to light the menorah, the candelabra in the temple each and every day. And therefore your lot, your portion is even greater than theirs. And the question is, how is lighting the menorah greater than bringing gifts for the dedication of the tabernacle? And the answer is quite obvious today. Because today we no longer have a tabernacle, and therefore we no longer bring offerings on the altar. However, we do light the menorah that Aaron lit each and every year on the holiday of Hanukkah. And therefore his portion, his lot, his mitzvah is an everlasting mitzvah that we still celebrate until this very day. Now, rabbis are teaching us a very fundamental lesson. Sometimes in life we may be envious of others. We may be envious of their position, of their role, of their accomplishments, as even Aaron was envious of the other tribes. And God says, don't be envious of others. I assigned a designated lot to every person in this world. And you may be envious of others, not realizing that your role and your lot is even of greater importance. It's a story that was recently published by a fellow by the name of Shmuley. And he tells a story that when he was a child in 7th grade, he was never a good student. He had ADHD. He couldn't sit for long. He couldn't focus. He couldn't concentrate. But he had this wonderful teacher in 7th grade who recognized that. So he put him in the front row. He let him fidget a little bit with his toys and his doodling in class. And whenever he saw he was getting bored, he would give him an assignment, like, could you go get a chalk for the blackboard? Or could you go get a cup of coffee? Or could you go run an errand to the principal's office? And little Shmuley, as a 7th grader, said he was delighted to jump out of his seat and do it. And he loved this teacher. One day the principal came in and said, unfortunately, your teacher took ill. He cannot continue. And we have a new rabbi, a new substitute, and introduced a new teacher. And Shmuley said, from the moment this teacher came in, he saw there was a sternness about him and that things were not going to be well. And sure enough, this teacher picked up on the fact that Shmuley was not concentrating, would always reprimand him and rebuke him and scold him and crumple up the papers he was writing on and throw it in the garbage. And suddenly this boy went from being a cheerful boy to being a very discouraged young man. Until one day the teacher called appearance into the school with the student, and the principal and the teacher came together to have a conference about what's going to be with Shmuley. And the teacher said in front of Shmuley and the parents, your son is not focusing, he's not learning. Everyone in my class has to learn. And then he said, if Shmuley doesn't start using his head, he's going to become a nothing in life. And Shmuley said these words were like a dagger in his heart. It destroyed him. And he lived with this pain and this hurt. Shmuley says, I went on in my life, thank God. I grew up, I got married, I started a family. And sure enough, I was never a good student. I became a plumber. But I'm a very happy plumber. I have a good life, I have a good wife, I have good children. And as a volunteer, I volunteer in Hatzalah, which is the ambulance service for volunteers, EMTs who rescue lives. And he said, here it is, 20 years later. I'm in my 30s now. And 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a call. Man had a heart attack. I jump out of bed. I run into my car, put on my siren, take my equipment. I run to a home, run into the house. And as soon as I dash to the floor to start taking the man's pulse, I recognized that it was my teacher, Rabbi substitute. I start performing emergency services on him. I see he doesn't have a pulse. I shock him back into rhythm, and sure enough, his heartbeat comes back. The ambulances arrived, they take him to the hospital, and literally saved his life. I go back to bed. About a month later, I get a phone call from the grandson of this man. He said, we're having a family friend celebration to celebrate the miraculous rescue that you performed on our grandfather. And of course, you're the volunteer who saved his life. You were the first on the scene. We'd like you to come as our guest of honor. Shmuley goes to this party and he's wondering, will the Rebbe recognize him? But sure enough, when he comes in, the Rabbi doesn't recognize him. He greets him warmly, thanks him, but he sees he doesn't recognize him because he was an 11-year-old kid then, and now he's a 30-year-old man. So, in the middle of the party, Shmuley calls the Rabbi to the side room and says, I'd like to talk to you. He says, do you recognize me? He says, no. He says, I was in your class. You were the substitute in my yeshiva in 7th grade. And he says, you're Shmuley so-and-so? He says, yes. And the Rabbi starts to cry and he hugs him and he says, I'm so sorry for the way I treated you, for what I said about you. And he says, I remember I said you would become a nothing, and look at you now. You saved my life. And then the Rabbi said, please come back into the living room with me. And he comes into the room and he asks for everyone's silence. And he tells the entire story to all of his guests. And he said, I want to apologize publicly to Shmuley for the way I treated him, the way I spoke to him. And then the Rabbi said, at the time I said that if he doesn't use his head, he will become a nothing. What I didn't realize is that he was going to use his big heart and his great hands to do something more important than what he could have done with his head. Every person is given greatness. Every person is given strengths and abilities and talents. And God says, look at what I've given you. Don't be envious of others. God has to tell Aaron, your lot will be even greater. Embrace your mission, your purpose, and then you will fulfill your role in this world. Have a wonderful day.